history and consistent with the Rotary four-way test, we should all fervently pray for peace. And in that spirit, I offer today the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. Lord, make us a channel of thy peace, that where there is hatred, we may bring love, that where there is wrong, we may bring forgiveness, that where there is error, we may bring truth, that where there is doubt, we may bring faith, that where there is despair, we may bring hope, that where there are shadows, we may bring light, that where there is sadness, we may bring joy. O Divine Master, grant that we may seek to comfort rather than be comforted, to understand rather than be understood, to love rather than be loved. For it is in giving that one receives, it is in self-forgetting that one finds, it is in pardoning that one is pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life.
Thank you, Jim. All right, stick with me. There's a lot of announcements. 5 pages. All right, again, I'm glad to be back in person with everyone today. And of course, with the protocol we're all experiencing and our masks, it certainly isn't business as usual. But again, for those who are not comfortable to be here and prefer home or office, virtual viewing is still available on YouTube. Again, we ask that you be patient with us as we work diligently to get this all right. If you drove here today, you would have received a ticket from the gate machine at the parking lot. It's a bit to get used to, but there are parking vouchers on the tables. If you leave today and you don't see one, be sure to check with Mary or myself, and we'll get you one. You'll put that in after your ticket that you got when you showed up. For those of us who turned in to Thursday's snack program, we had a chance to learn more about Sculpture Milwaukee last week. That's the installation of the sculptures along Wisconsin Avenue in the 3rd Ward with Mary Lou Canody, Chief Curator and Director of Education at Sculpture Milwaukee. Hope you were able to check that out. It is live on YouTube as well. Speaking of the 3rd Ward, it also so happens that the Coffee Connector Group will be meeting this Thursday morning, September 10th at 7:30 a.m. at Catalano Square in the 3rd Ward. So if you have a chance to stop by for coffee and conversation, or stroll along and take a look at the sculptures in the 3rd Ward, you can check out that more information on our website or contact Teresa Regan for more information. This Thursday at noon, our snack program will feature the Minority Health Film Festival with Gerard Blanks, Director of Cultures and Humanities, or Director of Cultures and Communities at Milwaukee Film, and Heidi Moore, who is the Director of Emerging Markets and Inclusion at Froedtert in the Medical College of Wisconsin. Join us for this straightforward conversation between Gerard and Heidi, discussing what the Minority Health Film Festival is, how it got started, and then talking about some highlights that are happening in this year's program. As a supporter of Milwaukee Health, or the Minority Health Film Festival, Rotary Club Milwaukee is proud to be sponsoring the film Charm City. Here's a brief overview of that film. On the streets of Baltimore, shooting is rampant. The murder rate is approaching an all-time high, and police distrust is at a fevered pitch. With nerves frayed and neighborhoods in distress, dedicated community leaders, passionate law enforcement officers, and progressive young city councilmen try to stem the epidemic of violence. Filmed over 3 tumultuous years, covering the lead up to and aftermath of Freddie Gray's death in police custody, Charm City is an intimate cinema verite portrait of those surviving in and fighting for the vibrant city they call home. Once again, Rotary is proudly sponsoring Hike Milwaukee, a fundraising event for the Urban Ecology Center and the Milwaukee Rotary Centennial Arboretum. That will run from September 27th till October 3rd. And since we are facing this pandemic, the event will be spread across the entire week. Participants can sign up for the hike of their choice with a maximum of 10 people per hike. And hopefully I get this right, but we have a message from Caitlin about the event.
Hello, Milwaukee Rotary Club. This is Caitlin Reinhardt, the forester at Urban Ecology Center. I'm actually talking to you from my campsite for Labor Day weekend. I'm camping in the Kettle Moraine, taking a little time with the family. But I just wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about Hike Milwaukee, which is coming up. First of all, I wanted to thank you guys so much for being a presenting sponsor of Hike Milwaukee. We count so much on the help that you all give us year in and year out, and we're so thankful that we call Milwaukee Rotary Club friends. I hope you're all getting excited about Hike Milwaukee coming up. I know I am. There are a lot of options for different guided hikes going through, doing our loop around the Milwaukee River. There's a virtual hike that you could take, that you could sign up for as well. I will be leading a virtual tour and also an in-person hike. There are special hikes specifically for the Rotary Club that you guys can sign up for to receive content that's special for you guys as a part of your hike. I hope you'll sign up soon, and I hope you'll come join us at Hike Milwaukee. If you sign up, you will receive a t-shirt as well. So that's an awesome selling point. Anyway, I'm really excited to see you all at Hike Milwaukee. I hope you'll join us, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. I hope you'll join us, and I hope you all have a wonderful week.
All right, so you can sign up for any of these hikes on the UEC's website. We'll also send out information directly to you. Specifically for Rotary, there are 3 scheduled hikes, 2 at the Arboretum and 1 along the lake, leaving from the War Memorial Plaza after our Tuesday lunch meeting. Plus, we will have access to the podcast from Caitlin, UEC's forester exclusively for Rotarians. So here are the hikes. Hike with fellow Rotarian Beth Heller from the War Memorial Plaza after lunch on Tuesday, September 29th. You can take the bird hike with Tori Bay at Riverside Park Tuesday, September 29th at 8 a.m. The tree hike with Caitlin will leave Riverside Park on Saturday, October 3rd. And the virtual hike, of course, with Caitlin will be via podcast anytime, anywhere. Click the link in this Friday's connector email to sign up. If you're joining us on YouTube today, please use the chat to ask your questions or text the questions to the number you see in the chat box. The questions will be relayed up to our speakers in the hall. And I'm sorry again that we can't offer Zoom now, but we'll be meeting now that we're meeting in person. As I said, please be patient with us as we all work diligently to get this as right as we can. And now I'd like to introduce fellow Rotarian David Hayes, editor of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel's Ideas Lab, a solutions for journalism effort in the news organization, will begin the program.
Okay, we're good. My experience always helps if you turn the mic on before you start talking. Okay, sounds great. Well, welcome everybody, both here at the War Memorial Center and watching on YouTube. We have a great program today, and I'm excited to bring up Dr. Patricia Hoben. Dr. Hoben, come on up. Dr. Hoben is the executive director of the City Forward Collective. It's an educational organization that has been working with dozens of schools in the area on their reopening plans, and that's what we're going to be talking about mostly here today. Dr. Hoben has worked in federal science, technology, and public health policy. She's worked in molecular biology and biochemistry research, in nonprofit management,
and in science education philanthropy. She led a citywide science education reform initiative in Minneapolis. Most recently, of course, we know her as the founding chief executive officer for Carmen Schools for Technology, Science and Technology. Carmen is a nationally recognized network of college and career preparatory schools. These are public charter schools that includes 3 high schools, 2 middle schools, and an elementary school. Dr. Hoben holds a doctorate in molecular biophysics and biochemistry from Yale University. I also might add that she's active on nonprofit boards in our community, including the Harbor District, the Milwaukee Public Museum, Teach for America, and all in Milwaukee. So Dr. Hoben, welcome. Thanks for being here. All right.
Okay.
We will be loud. So, Dr. Hoben, first, a kind of a really basic question. Why are educators and most parents so passionate about making sure that their kids have an opportunity at least to have some in-school classroom work this year? What is it about in-school that is so important to people?
Well, I think from talking to families and my own experience raising children in school, I would say the biggest reason is the dynamic between the student and the teacher and that relationship that can never be usurped by online education. There's a dynamic that goes on in an in-person classroom instruction that we're trying to ascribe to Zoom technology and other means, but it's not quite the same as in person.
Um, and, and so related to that, we all know that across the country and even in Wisconsin, there occasionally have been some issues already with some COVID being discovered in schools. And with the possibility, a real possibility of a second wave of virus this fall, do you believe that it's even possible to have a plan in place that can guarantee safety for students, educators, and their families?
I think it's possible to have a plan in place, and I think it's necessary because one thing I want to just add to what I said before is for some children, there are services that are provided in schools besides instruction. There's social service, there's food. Many children have 2, if not 3 meals a day for after-school programs, and special services surrounding things like special education. So we have to come up with a plan that will work. And I think that the guidance we have now from the state and in Milwaukee from the City of Milwaukee Health Department is sufficient, that if we follow the guidelines and put precautions in place, we can open safely.
So some schools are around the state are open in person. Some are opening remotely and may go to in person. Some are sort of the A and B thing. In fact, I have a sister-in-law in Grand Rapids who's doing the A and B thing. She's finding it quite challenging at this point. I want to talk to you a little bit about the challenges that teachers face, educators face. But you worked on the plan for the Milwaukee County Health Department and the checklist. Can you talk a little bit about what's included in that?
Yeah, I worked on actually the schools in Milwaukee, which is the ones that I've been focused on, are under the guidance of the City of Milwaukee Health Department. So the county health department didn't create a specific guidance for schools that our city schools have to follow. And what the health department did is they worked with Milwaukee Public Schools as a district. But in our city, we actually have about 136 schools under the district, managed and operated by the district. We have 146 schools that are either public charter or private schools that receive public funding via vouchers. And so when the health department recognized that, there was clearly a need to get input from all of those different sectors. And so I worked on a working group with the City of Milwaukee Health Department that represented the charter and choice sectors, so that there would be an understanding of what all different schools had to operate under. And what there was in place already over the summer was a guidance that had been developed for restaurants and bars. And that checklist now, by September 15th, all restaurants and bars have to have submitted a plan that's been approved by the health department. So they wanted to create a model like that for K-12. The only thing that I wish, and all of us wish, is that we had started that in May rather than in late July or early August, so that schools could truly be ready to open. What the checklist includes is everything from what your plan has to be as soon as somebody walks in the door, what kind of testing you're going to do, what kind of survey questions you're going to ask people to understand whether or not they meet criteria for possibly having been exposed to COVID, to how you set up your classrooms, and how you're going to manage to be no more than 50% occupied based on your permitted occupancy for a building. School leaders now are having to learn everything about the best personal protection equipment, the best cleaning fluids, what percent alcohol you have to have, how many minutes it has to be on a classroom desk. And so the checklist, I actually have it here, it's 8 pages long. And your plan has to show where every one of those items is addressed.
Just on the testing aspect of that, do you believe that the schools in the city have enough access to testing that they can get back quickly enough in case they need?
So schools per se, well, schools have been closed since COVID started in the spring. And so those schools that are opening now, really only in the last week or so, are not being required to test their staff or test their students. I don't think there are enough testing available. My concern about it, and I think everybody's shared concern, is 40% of positive cases are asymptomatic, and 50% of community spread, as I understand it, is through asymptomatic individuals. So if we're not testing our staff and students, then surely we're going to have some positive cases in schools, and somebody will become symptomatic. And but if they don't, we could have an outbreak in schools and not even know it.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder if we could get back to the challenge of educators in the classroom phase. I mean, I could imagine if I was a teacher of, say, younger children, keeping them apart. They don't want to be kept apart, right? But my sister-in-law was talking about with this AB regime that they're using in East Grand Rapids, where she teaches. She said, it's really a lot more work because we have to have the kids aren't sort of all learning in A and B at the same rate necessarily. So maybe just talk about what we're asking of educators.
Yeah, so let me just try to explain what I think David's referencing is an example of hybrid instruction. So the options are everybody's in school, everybody's out of school, or some combination. So for some families, they're getting the option to opt out of in-person instruction. And so that means the teacher is responsible for having some kids in the building and some kids out of the building. Right now in Milwaukee, you can only have your building occupied at 50% of its capacity. So the only way to get more than 50% generally of your students is to take over your gym and your cafeteria or other spaces and turn them into classrooms, which some schools are doing. The other option for a hybrid instruction is A days and B days. So that might mean your elementary school children are coming at one time and your high school students are coming at another time, depending on the type of school, 2 days a week, 3 days a week. Every permutation that you include is one that requires the teacher to do more work to try to figure out. So if somebody is in person receiving instruction, there's still children at home that have to be taught as well. So there has to be lesson plans for both of those. So it's on top of becoming a health and safety professional, social service professional, a teacher has many jobs.
Maybe an IT professional too.
Well, an IT professional, absolutely. So, yeah.
Well, so talk about that. There's, I would think, not being an educator, but I would think that there's quite a difference between teaching online over Zoom or whatever the tech platform is, and that in-person instruction where you can walk to the desk of the student and help with their math or whatever it is they're working on. How have educators dealt with, and I know in the spring it was like just thrown at them, so they had no time to deal with it, but how have they prepared now for that sort of hybrid situation they're in?
So I think, some are better prepared than others. First of all, depending on what they did over the summer. So a lot of schools, stepped forward and made a plan early enough in the summer so that they could undertake the training to assist their teachers in becoming savvy with these platforms. But I think what it's allowing people to do, too much instruction in a K-12 environment has been teacher talking, student listening, large group. Some classes are as many as 45 students, which is too many to begin with. What technology is allowing people to do, either in this hybrid scenario or within a classroom, is to be using platforms in a way so that the amount of time that a teacher is actually talking and instructing is less, and students have more time to engage in the work using some online platforms and making sense of their learning. But meanwhile, that frees up the teacher to have time to work in small groups, which is really important this fall because last spring, particularly in our central city where 80% of our students live in low-income households, there is a lot of catching up to do. And so we can't go back to where we were before. We have to accelerate the learning. And so I think the tech tools are giving us some ways, some new ways to do things that not only will be helpful in accelerating learning lost for students that need it the most, but also hopefully in some permanent ways to make instruction more engaging. So for example, if an at-home instruction, a teacher may have videoed a lesson with some guidance on what to do with that. And normally somebody's sitting there from 11 to 12 and maybe that student doesn't really feel like engaging at that time. But now that it's on, they can go back and listen to it any time and engage when it makes the most sense for them. It's really an opportunity for some students as well.
So for the kids who aren't in in-person classrooms right now, who are not, what's the challenge for the kids who don't have their classmates sitting next to them? Is there a way to overcome that with technology?
So I think what we've seen is
Project learning, for example.
There's projects that they can do, but the question is, how do they engage with each other when they can't humanly interact with each other? So, through Zoom technology, you can divide your class of 20 or 30 up into 5 small groups and have them be working together on a project. The problem we're facing, though, in the city right now is this internet access issue. So the other problem we're facing with that at home is when it works for Maria to be online from 10 to 11, it doesn't work for Jose to be online from 10 to 11. And so how do they find time to get together? And so what we're asking children to do and youth is really execute their personal agency too, because there's a lot of student ownership of learning that has to happen to really make sure that the opportunities that are being given to them are fully, taken advantage of. And I think that's another challenge that we're facing.
Well, that gets at something you said gets at a question I had, which is about the inequities that we face in our community, where even in the city, but especially suburbs versus city, there's children just have in the suburbs often have a lot more advantages. Everything from internet access and bandwidth issues to the quality of the schools that they actually, physical quality of the schools they go to. Can you talk a little bit about how the current situation is impacting our poorest students and what the community and the schools are trying to do to overcome that?
Yeah, so what we were finding in the spring from surveys of families, as best that those could be undertaken, is that about 20% of families don't have reliable internet. Some schools have told me that when they were re-enrolling students back in the late summer and fall, that's for some schools that's more like 30 or 40% don't have reliable internet. So that's just basically an inequity that's been revealed that those that have been running schools in central cities have known for a long time and wish they could do something about. But to include in your budget purchasing of home internet access for a 12-month, is more than anybody's, financial ability. So one inequity from, say, our central city kids to surrounding suburban areas is the internet access. And, another one is facilities. We have a huge infrastructure problem in, Milwaukee. We have many buildings that are almost 100 years old and no plan and resources in place to really turn those around. One of the things that schools have to undertake is an assessment of ventilation before they bring kids back in the home. Well, or back in the school, and ventilation in a lot of our buildings in the city is opening windows and blowing fans as best you can, whereas in our suburban schools, where the schools have been updated and upgraded, air conditioning is a standard thing, and good ventilation. We've known, and it was when the Milwaukee Public Schools did their referendum this summer, there was a fair amount of press around the differences in the public per pupil between the district and surrounding districts. But even within our city, the choice and charter schools get less per pupil money than the district does. And also the choice and charter schools, which represent 46,000 kids in this city, don't have access to any of the referendum money. So, it's not just inequities outside of the city with the city, but inside. And then another inequity that I think I'm really wanting to look into more, I know it's playing out in other cities around the country, is the actual minutes of instruction. Now that we're in this virtual environment, different schools, across the city, teachers unions working with districts are negotiating how many minutes a day and what kind of minutes those will be. So in some districts, people have their teacher or access to their teacher up to 6 hours a day. In other, it's really 1 hour a day. And so what does that mean? And how are we going to take children that are already far behind their peers from a countywide basis when we're talking about our city's children, and then mount on top of that all of these issues that have revealed themselves. But these are all issues that have been around for a long time, and we've tried to do workarounds. I think we just have to acknowledge that we can no longer do workarounds, and our kids matter, and they're the future of our city and our economy. And without functioning schools, with access to resources, we won't have a functioning economy moving forward.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about earlier the various sectors of education we have in Milwaukee. Milwaukee is one of the most educationally diverse cities in the country, with choice, charter, voucher, and the public schools. Are they essentially on the same page in terms of how to operate, would you say? Us at the health department?
How to operate under the COVID circumstances?
Under the current circumstances, yeah.
How to operate, I'm not sure they're on the same page, but I would say under COVID, yes. I mean, first of all, I just want to say our City of Milwaukee Health Department, the way the things go is first it's the CDC, and then it's the State Department, and then it's the county, and then it's the city. Our city was waiting for certain things to happen. For example, school. Ultimately, the city wrote, the strategy for how we're going to handle an outbreak. And so they've done a phenomenal job. They've bent over backwards with a very limited staff to work with the district and the charter and choice schools, and they've listened to the input about what's realistic. So they've created a set of guidelines, but they're not trying to hold people accountable to things that just simply can't be done with the current facility that you operate in or the current amount of resources that you might have available, human or dollars-wise. Mm-hmm. So I'm very pleased with what I've seen, and I think I can speak. I've worked with leaders from across all three sectors, and I think that would be a consensus.
So just back up a second too on educators and what we're asking of classroom teachers. Have classroom teachers been able to get additional instruction for themselves in order to prepare for this new reality that they find themselves in?
I think that, over the course of the summer, there was a lot of training that went on. One of the things we've learned through all of the work with Zoom and virtual instruction is professional development is much more efficient using those technologies than leaving your building and going off. And so, or there may be a webinar that was, available that you can tune into at 10 o'clock. So I believe teachers have had access to the training they need to use the technology platforms that are available. There's never enough time. I think some schools are definitely building into the normal weekday some time for professional development, recognizing that it's not just about what we planned for, but it's what we saw play out once we implemented, and how we do that. I think we need to think of professional development as something that goes on continuously and isn't something we do in the summer or the beginning of the school year or once a quarter. And I think this technology and the savvy that teachers are acquiring through using it are really going to help us moving forward when we get out of this as well.
I was going to ask you, are there things that teachers and school districts are learning, that you're learning, that you think are actually innovations that will make things better when we're finally beyond COVID?
I think what I don't know that we're at this stage. So, there's 3 stages, right? There's response, recovery, and reinvention. We're still in the recovery stage. So I think that we're seeing opportunities for reinvention, but we're not quite clear what they're going to look like. One of the things that we invested in at City Forward Collective this summer was a national summer school initiative where you had a group of very high performing, what we'll call mentor teachers, who were working with a national cadre of schools throughout the country where there were partner teachers and, of course, students. The students were undertaking summer school, and the goal here was, to eliminate all the lost learning from the spring as best possible going into the fall. And so what we had is every day a teacher, often a first year, second year, third year teacher, partner teacher locally, was being mentored with a 1-hour professional development session. And the teacher could either use the lesson that the mentor teacher developed, and that the students could take advantage of that lesson, or the teacher from watching the partner teacher from watching the mentor teacher could then execute their own lesson in the best way. So there's some innovative opportunities there for training for sure. I think the other is, mixed during the day. Again, we don't need teachers talking all the time. We need students time to make sense of the learning and to engage in the learning. And teachers always want opportunities to work in small groups. And I think now that they feel much more savvy with some of these technological platforms, they're going to be able to integrate that into the day so the day can look different and feel different.
So are the teachers actually more available to their students?
They can be, depending on how it's structured. I know some schools felt so badly that last spring they weren't able to connect with so many of their kids because of internet access or because of not feeling confident using these tools. And so now they're saying, well, in the fall, I'm going to have 4.5 hours of what we call synchronous instruction, which is in-person instruction. Well, how many third graders in their home environment are going to be able to absolutely be tuned in from 8:30 to 1:30 every day? Anybody here who's had to have a child home or a grandchild home during COVID understands what it takes. We have older children that have to take care of younger children. So, we have to come up with ways to engage all of the learners, and it may not be in this traditional synchronous live instruction with your teacher there.
Well, something you said just struck a chord with me. I mean, there's a challenge for families too, right? With when kids are not in school, families where both parents have to work, and so what have you seen with that?
So I think 2 things are happening. One is there are schools in the city that are reopening to students who need it the most. So we have students that don't have internet or students whose parents work. Again, 80+% of our families that send their kids to publicly funded schools in this city are low-income households. Somebody needs to work in that house. It's either going to be the high school student who's home from school, or it's going to be one or both of the parents or an aunt or an uncle. And so they need to either to send their child to school, and some schools are opening just for those small populations to start, working through how to operate in this kind of an environment. And then others are relying on childcare centers. So the Boys and Girls Club and the YMCA that normally operate at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day are now approved to do some full day programs. The problem with that is they are not there to teach. The teachers still are virtually working with the students. So there's a lot of training that needs to go on for those childcare providers, particularly the in-home childcare providers, who again normally have the children in the morning and after school and now have to have them all day. They may have their kids from representing, 5 or 8 different schools that are doing things 5 or 8 different ways. So we really need to bridge the divide between K-12 and the early childhood centers and the special, community learning centers and other things, so that everybody is equipped with the resources and the understandings and trainings that they need to help those children that are in their care.
I was going to ask you about that. The schools have spent a lot of time getting ready for this. Is there good coordination at this point with before school and after school care programs?
So I think there are, so for example, Milwaukee Public Schools has some centers, that operate out of their buildings. And I think that in those places where that happens, I think that, Danae Davis and Milwaukee Succeeds, the Civic Action Committee that the Greater Milwaukee Foundation has been running, they have convened a group of us from K-12 to work with the early childhood care providers. And that's just started in the last couple of weeks. So we have somebody at our organization who's going to be providing some trainings for parents, because that's the other thing we haven't talked about is in order for parents to support their kids, they have to have the same trainings that those of us who are using the technology do. So some of the things that have been developed for parents, we're also going to be sharing with the care providers. I think what the biggest issue that I see as we look at our city is because we have this eclectic this really diverse ecosystem that you talked about. We have traditionally in most cities you have your large district, and if you go to them, you kind of figure it out, and everybody else will go along. But our district is 66,000 kids. The charter and choice are 46,000. That's almost half, and we don't have kind of a central coordinating mechanism to really put us all on the same page. Not that we should all be doing things the same way, but there should be some certain minimum understandings, minimum standards. How many minutes a day of access to your teacher do you have? Those to me are citywide issues, and not something that if you're fortunate enough to be somewhere, you therefore get. And I think a lot of cities, some of that operates at the city level, because we're not the only city with a diverse group of sectors here. And those are things that we've seen play out during this crisis. Is everybody knows there's a problem, but nobody knows exactly who's in charge or who's going to convene us or bring us all together around solutions.
So back to the inequities question. I've heard that some suburban parents who have children who may only be going to in-person classroom school twice a week are hiring tutors to help their kids the other couple of days of the week, which if I could afford it, I would too. But what about the kids in the city who might also benefit from that? Now, at this point, a lot of them are all remote, but is there tutoring available to help these kids keep up?
So I think what David's talking about is these parent pods. So there's 2 ways those are operating, mostly in suburbia, mostly in middle or higher income locations. And either the parents, it's really, one of my colleagues called it homeschooling on steroids. It's basically where you find the expert algebra teacher among your parent friends, the expert language teacher, and then you share responsibilities with a group and you cohort together in a safe way. Or you hire a retired teacher or you hire a tutor. And those things are not, in our central cities, families have to work and do not have necessarily the luxury, certainly of playing that role as a parent when they're working all day, nor do they have the finances to be able to hire a retired teacher on a full-time basis and share that cost. That's what they rely on public education for. And what we are seeing crop out, though, I know UWM has been working with some of their students who are going through training to become educators. They've tried to connect with families to, provide some one-to-one tutoring. The problem with some of those programs, because some of those people reached out to us, was trying to find somebody full-time to manage that and coordinate the parents, because of course they have the right intention, but they don't know how to access the parents. Or there's an organization like ours that operates out of Indianapolis, and they've made a $200,000 investment in learning centers where they've hired tutors to go to centers like our community learning centers, and then parents can sign up to go there for specific kind of tutoring. We don't have something like that in Milwaukee, but again, those are external-based things. It's almost, you need somebody to come to you. There's often a problem with getting your child somewhere during the day. Bus transportation is now an issue, for even kids that want to go to school. There's limited ridership there. So trying to take your child even to a friend's house in the middle of the day to get tutoring isn't necessarily something that all of us have access to.
Let's leave it there and open it up to questions. There in the back, and I'll repeat the question.
So I have a question regarding kind of long-term effects of this. Studies out that this could fundamentally change how children interact with each other. And I guess where do we balance the long-term effects of socialization and the effects of this children not having access to each other and teachers in person and the risk of contracting COVID-19? Because at some point it seems to me that the long-term effects of this are going to outweigh the concern about
So balancing, how do we balance as a city, a state, the sort of long-term impact of loss of socialization and the other benefits of in-house classroom teaching versus the risks of the coronavirus?
I think that's a question on everybody's mind, and as I said earlier, the teacher now wears so many hats, including social service provider, and so an social emotional wellness provider for children at home. That's the greatest concern. The American Association of Pediatrics. That's why they recommended that people go back. And, our most vulnerable students are the ones that need that support the most. So I think that this is what all the schools are working toward, is being able to reopen safely. I don't know of a school who doesn't plan to reopen safely. I don't know of a school who doesn't have parents who want to send their kids back and want to send their kids back now. But I think that we have to give the schools time to navigate. We have this 8-page checklist of things that they have to do to get their schools ready. It's one thing to write a plan. It's another thing to execute a plan. So one of the things we're doing to help teachers this fall and school leaders is, how do we create exercises where we actually try to play out what could happen. Somebody gets sick in your classroom. That happens all the time in an elementary school classroom, but in the age of COVID, how is that going to play out? What is every step that we're going to take? How are we going to ensure that we don't have an outbreak? And I think one way to ensure that, of course, is that everybody in our city wear masks. That people, because we now know so much about asymptomatic transmission, and as long as we're going to have things going on outside of the schools that are unsafe and going to propagate this further, we're not going to be able to get all of our kids back in the building. And so I think everybody supports, the concern you have. And I think there are things that we also need to do to make up for the fact that students are not engaging with each other and all the social impact of that and the mental health impact of that we as adults feel, but particularly children who rely on their peers, so much. But there are some things we can do remotely to support children in that. And I think that's what we're trying to dig into now.
Great question. Can she speak to the teachers who are declining to work or cannot work in the area?
We haven't done a survey, so I can't speak to that. I think you need to have survey data. We heard last spring from national surveys that 20% of teachers won't be returning to work because of COVID. But what's happened is because over 85% of schools have said that they're going to start the year virtually, that hasn't played out so much. When I talked to schools recently who are opening or getting ready to open, there are teachers who can opt out of in-person instruction because of the risk factors that they may meet. There's criteria that the health department has published on that. But I think that we don't know yet the answer to that question, and we would have to really survey all of our teachers to figure out who's not going to go back. Once they're required to go back, but they don't meet any of those personal risk criteria that would allow them to work from home.
Yes, ma'am. So the question was about truancy? Yeah, given the concern about inequities in the system.
Yeah, you know, the truancy, so there was truancy rates before COVID, as you pointed out, and worse after COVID. There are children still that haven't been found since last spring. When I say found, I mean they haven't, you know, reconnected with teachers or schools or whatever. And I think that, again, it's September 7th. So some schools are just opening, and it's premature. You know, MPS opened their high schools a couple weeks ago, but they're just opening their elementary schools now. So I don't think we have the data to see how this year it's playing out. But last year, you know, we did a survey, we did a poll that we haven't published yet, but one piece of data on it said that, you know, 40% of families in Milwaukee did not access their teacher. You know, so they're not necessarily, are they truant, or was that what the school did or didn't do? And how we're going to track attendance and all of that. These are policy issues that we're still grappling with Department of Public Instruction. You know, last spring there were waivers, and so people stopped tracking certain things, but now it's, you know, those waivers haven't been reinstituted clearly across the board for the fall. So, you know, you raise a really important point, but we can't afford to lose a single one of our children. And what I hope we can do through this technology is for students who are in home situations, which some students are, that make it impossible for them to come to school, how do we leverage some of the virtual instruction and some of the things we've created now to make sure that they get access to education anyway? I mean, I think that's where an innovation could be for some of our neediest kids, if we manage it right.
Other questions? So what are the options to deal with the technology divide in the community?
So in some cities, Nashville is an example, they use their CARES Act money, which is the federal money in the first round that went out, and cities got CARES Act money. And, you know, there's a lot of needs the cities are grappling with because of COVID, from, you know, housing and food distribution and all of that. But some cities have chosen to use those block grants for internet access for all low-income families, or, you know, they've been able to sometimes collaborate with their providers, like Spectrum and others here. We had low-cost or free internet access last spring that didn't continue. So now what's going on in our city is the district had, you know, the Milwaukee Public Schools Foundation raised money to provide internet access for the kids there. And we at City Forward Collective have been raising money to provide internet access for the students in all the other schools. And so, but, you know, neither of those initiatives are really going to reach 100% of that 20% that don't have it. And so we need a permanent solution. The mayor, I know, cares about this, and, you know, has reached out to others, but I think that it's a balance between all of the needs right now. And I think there was a committee in 2013 that looked at this. There are different ways to do this, and there's been models in the country, but the money is going to have to come in part from the schools and part from the city. And, you know, that's what we've got to figure out. And we need to stop worrying, at least in the education sector, we need to step aside from all of this intersector warfare and just say, you know, all these children matter. We all need to, you know, make sure everybody, but it isn't just the kids. I worry about, you know, we're talking so many low-income households in our city. there are jobs that if you had internet access, you'd be able to work in that you can't work in because of that. And so it isn't just our children that are being poorly served by this. But right now, there's nothing underway beyond private funding on an interim basis for these things. And you know, it's going to be a year that at least many of our kids are going to be out.
I have a question from YouTube.
Understanding there are some very successful fully remote learning schools now. Are any of the quote-unquote regular schools in the area
So are schools learning from one another? In other words, successful online schools or non-traditional schools, are public schools, for example, learning from them?
You know, this is just my opinion. It has nothing to do. I don't, but I can say I have a niece who spent 4 years being educated by a K-12 kind of online school, and without her mother and father and a paid tutor, she would not have gotten through her. You know, she's a star tennis athlete, and I think that again, in the middle and upper middle class segments of our society, that's where there's been a lot of use of K-12 successfully because it's been supplemented with others. There isn't a lot of data showing that students that come in 2-3 years behind and try to go online in one of those kinds of schools have been successful. We have some local charter schools here, at least one local charter school that runs a high school, but even they have some in-person opportunity to support the online instruction that they do. And that's what we see the need for. So it's a mixed bag out there.
And another YouTube question. How is remote learning affecting the parents who are at home and their work schedules?
I mean, it's devastating them, right? So if you're a family who can't afford to hire a tutor, can't take your child somewhere, can't, you know, do that, which is most of the families in the city, they love their children and they want their children in school and safe or at home with access to teachers. And not all of them are in a position to make that happen for their kids.
Yes, sir.
With teachers working twice as hard to get the children the instruction they need, is there more of an argument, or is it being discussed as it relates to year-round school as a concept, as a way of keeping students engaged? Because it certainly may not be the last time that we're experiencing pandemic.
So with asking teachers to work harder and this concern about kids losing what they've learned, given the sort of start and stop nature of what we're in, the question is, should we be looking more seriously at full year schools, year round?
You know, there are year-round schools. I know MPS experimented with year-round schools in the past, but year-round isn't necessarily 12 months of instruction. Year round is more, you get 3 weeks off and 2 weeks off to, so that the discontinuity isn't so great. I think the problem with that is unless everybody does it, it's a hard thing to do. It's hard for families when some of your kids are in a year-round school that has these schedules with 3 weeks and 2 weeks here that don't align. So that's the issue. I think schools in this city that are doing well in terms of high academic achievement often run summer schools and make those open to children, not just who are struggling, but for enrichment opportunities as well. So I think those opportunities are out there. I think the question is now with some of the virtual opportunities and online courses, will there be more opportunity for that that's kind of a mixed in-person and hybrid? I think that's potentially some of the innovations that may come out of this.
Other questions? Yes, sir. So how do you balance online versus in-person teaching, and is there a risk of kids falling behind because teachers just don't have enough time?
Well, there's a risk, one of the things we're sitting in right now is we have no data for how our students ended the year last year anyway. We have no data in some spaces for how they're starting the year because of, different expectations. I think that, again, what teachers are trying to implement this year is when they have students at home and students in the classroom, they're trying to create synchronous time for the students who are at home so that they're actually in the same classroom, but using the technology. That is a problem, however, because while everybody would like to have, is what I said earlier, 4.5 hours of scheduled time a day that people find that students will follow a strict schedule. It's not possible in every household to be able to have that student available to be in that synchronous instruction with the in-person. And so what's going to have to happen is the teacher's going to have time freed up more than they normally do in a normal school year to work with individual students and groups of students who are at home. And they're going to have to map that out over the course of a week so that really everybody should be getting the same amount of minutes of time with their teacher, whether they're in person or out of person. And then both in school and out of school, there's going to have to be more student engagement through learning platforms that they may be in there with their teacher, but they're working on something on their own in a project, and the teacher is maybe sitting in that classroom but working virtually with others. And so it's a complicated thing, and you can make it more complicated or less complicated. For some hybrid, it's just, you have a group of kids at home and a group of kids at school every day, and you're doing something different with each of those, but ultimately giving them the same, if you can. That's the easiest way, and then there's levels of complexity beyond that.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. You mean the COVID risk? The, well, that's what was so interesting because last July, it became apparent that in the end of June, the health department said that schools can't reopen until we get into a certain phase. But youth programs and childcare centers were open. And so the question was, what's different about that? And that's exactly what we said to the health department. And they said, and what the answer was, well, actually, schools were closed in the summer. We intended to reopen them, and but the reality is, those centers were allowed at that time to operate at 75% capacity, and still are. And schools are only allowed to open at 50% capacity. So those disconnects do still happen. The other problem is a lot of those centers they're not, their infrastructure isn't for full-time staffing. They hire a lot of part-time staff, so they're also struggling to get the full-time staff. And again, they're not teachers, and so they work in pods like everybody else. So they have these, 10 kids in a room. Those 10 kids do everything together. They don't interact with the other 10 kids. So their requirements are very similar to schools. And they haven't had outbreaks. And so I think that's the encouraging news, for our schools, which is why schools want to open. Some schools want to open.
I think maybe
I didn't answer your question, or what was your? Yeah. 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 Right, because those other centers should not be trying to be teachers. That's not their role. That's not what they're set up for. And in fact, they're not allowed to accept their funding if they don't abide by that. So they can help students as though they need homework help, but they don't have to help them. They don't have to provide internet, for example. That's not a requirement. They're trying to, though, because they feel that obligation. And which is why, you know, we need to, as best as possible, open schools to those students who need the access the most, and then work our way into the larger population. And I believe that's what our city is trying to do in some of the sectors.
So I think we have time for one more question, if there's any more questions out there. It looks like there's one in the back here. Yes, sir.
The novel coronavirus right now, pandemic, very real chance that the pandemic can become endemic to our society. Is there been any thought on the part, Patricia, of folks whom you're speaking with on how to accept the coronavirus as an everyday part of our existence?
So what happens as if the coronavirus actually becomes endemic and that it's just here to stay?
Yeah, you know, so nobody wants to think about that, you know, but again, you know, as long as you're mixing age populations, and we have teachers in our schools who are susceptible and vulnerable to this, so they are at risk if we are putting kids less than 6 feet apart, if we're not wearing masks, if we're not using proper cleaning supplies. So as long as, whether it's endemic to our society or not, as long as it's there, schools will have the responsibility to their employees and to those high-risk children that they serve to keep them safe. And right now, the only way we know how to do that is masking, social distancing, and cleaning surfaces.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Dr. Patricia Hoben, thank you very much.
Dr. Hoben, Dave, thank you so much for being here. In honors of leaders like you who speak to our club members, we'll be making a donation to the YWCA of Southeastern Wisconsin in your name, whose mission is eliminating racism, empowering women, promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. Tune in this Thursday at noon for our snack program on Zoom to learn more about the Minority Health Film Festival. Join us next Tuesday to hear from new County Executive David Crowley. As a reminder, if you'd like to attend in person, we need your RSVP in the Rotary office by 8 a.m. on Friday morning. Please see the link in this morning's email to RSVP for next Tuesday. Again, the Coffee Connector group will be meeting this Thursday morning, September 10th, at 7:30 a.m. at Catalano Square in the 3rd Ward. Contact Teresa Regan for more information. Remember, please social distance on your way out. Use both doors, and don't congregate by the elevator. Take the stairs if you're able. And don't be like me last time and get all the way downstairs without my parking validation and have to walk all the way back up. I did that. Thank you all for being here. The meeting's adjourned.